I want to take a moment, or rather, a decent amount of your time, to talk about my relationship to science and how I feel about it. You see, my relationship with science is sort of a capricious relationship. There's been times in my life where I was completely dedicated to science, and I believed in it wholeheartedly. And I was convinced without a doubt that what it was saying was unequivocally true. And then there were times in my life where I was completely dedicated to philosophy, into thinking about things in a way which was abstract. And I think this is the fundamental role of the philosopher: to question everything, to constantly think about the idea and the notion of what is truth. And this is something that I began to think about quite extensively over the course of my early 20s. I guess I'm still in my early 20s, being that I'm 24, although I feel much older. Nonetheless, as I began to ponder the idea of what is truth, and after my studying through the sciences, it became rather conspicuous to me that when science says that what they have discovered or observed is the truth, an axiom, or canonical, what they are saying is that they have observed this thing, and that what they have observed, for some reason to them, they believe is an adequate description. But I say that this is merely anthropomorphic. And even if we start to think about it logically, philosophically, we begin to understand that the only way that we can describe something is by way of language. You see, the prodigious edifice of what you might call or describe as language is nothing but a vehicle for the intellect to assert its will onto things by making observations. And as I began to ponder, to think about the sciences, and in particular, quantum mechanics. You see, quantum mechanics is essentially predicated on the observation that if we know the velocity of a particle, then we cannot simultaneously know the position of this particle, whether it be an electron or what have you, on the quantum level, on the micro level. So you see, this is called the uncertainty principle. On the micro level, on the quantum level of reality, everything is essentially uncertain and locked up in some sort of inextricable juxtaposition. And even if we recall Schrodinger's cat, the cat was dead and alive. At the same time, the potentialities of it being dead and the potentialities of it being alive were a possibility until the cat was observed. And it isn't until we make our observation that a thing becomes what it is. So what does this mean? I think that this points to the inescapable flux if we think about Alfred North Whitehead, when he said, "In the inescapable flux, there is something that abides. In the overwhelming permanence, there is an element that escapes into flux. Permanence can be snatched out of the flux. In the passing moment, can find its adequate intensity only by its submission to permanence." And this was what he would call the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So essentially what the scientist is doing when he makes his presumptions and his observations and proclaims that something is canonical, what he is doing is using the edifice of language, which is the vehicle that we use to describe things. And what this vehicle is essentially something that we use to describe things in a way that we see fit. But the question is this vehicle, is the language that we use correct? You see, when I call a chair, is that chair a chair? Or is this just a noise coming out of my mouth? You see, the chair is not a chair. The chair is the chair. But when I call it a chair, it doesn't mean that that's what it is. Because that's not the thing in itself. That is not the material that it is made out of. And you see, this is a question of identity. And this is something that I began to think about in my ponderings. Because you see, I believed in science wholeheartedly. But then I began to question. I started to read the philosophies. I heard about the categorical imperative, which Immanuel Kant talked about rather extensively in his critique of pure reason. And at least this is my interpretation, and what I got from it is that we can never actually speak of the thing in itself. As soon as we speak about what something is, we are speaking concreteness into the flux, if we recall Whitehead again. And even if we were to think about Heraclitus and his beautiful philosophy, in one of his most famous quotes, that the same man does not step in the, or a man does not step in the same river twice, for it is not the same river and he is not the same man. You see, this is a little story about personal identity and how we are somehow locked up in this continual state of flux, and that we are never the same in each passing moment, in each passing second, in each passing millisecond, day, night, week, month, year. We are constantly changing. We are never the same person because we cannot be. Because everything is constantly changing and in a state of flux. Everything is uncertain and moving, but not destroyed. Even if we think about it thermodynamically, and if we start to elaborate on the idea of syntropy and entropy, or what you might call nega-entropy, the state of high orderliness, complexity, and entropy, the state of decay, dispersal, and death. You see, this is something I started to think about, and something that became increasingly interesting to me. And as a philosopher, I believe it is our responsibility to take something that is seemingly inextricable, to separate it, to think about it, to begin to understand it, so then you can subsequently speak about it in a way that is assimilable to the listener, which is what I am attempting to do. So if we were to think about the balancing act between syntropy and entropy, between life and death, Syntropy being life, entropy being death and decay. You see, this seems to be a fundamental law of the universe. Things decay, entropy increases. You can see this in something as simple as your room. When you clean your room, you increase the orderliness of the room. Therefore, you increase its syntropy. And you will notice, even just in a couple of hours or days, your room has started to become messy again. Why? Because entropy has increased. Things have dispersed. This is the path of least resistance. This is what happens in the universe. Why? I don't exactly know. But it's interesting, isn't it? You see, entropy states, or rather, it is believed by science that the total entropy of the universe stays constant and the total syntropy of the universe stays constant. Because if we think about the first law of thermodynamics, it states that energy is conserved, that it cannot be created or destroyed, but merely changed. Which is interesting. And I continue to keep thinking about this. And I thought about this balancing act of syntropy and entropy, of orderliness and disorderliness. And it became rather interesting to me, because it seems, and if we think about it in terms of yin and yang, lightness and the darkness, unconscious, consciousness, the ego or the intellect seems to be somewhere in the middle. It's sort of juggling these things, these complementary opposites. Because you see, they go together. You cannot have light without darkness. You cannot have consciousness without unconsciousness. You can't have cold without hot. You can't have any belief without the other. They go together. And this brings us back to the whole entire idea of knowing something's velocity but not its position, and vice versa, if we speak quantum mechanically. So therefore, they go together. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot have the idea of one without the other. And because of this, it seems that it is almost impossible to speak truth. To adequately speak about something and describe it in a way that is 100% accurate. Because as soon as we make an observation, we are already disconnected from the thing. When I look at a chair, I've looked at it. And by simply looking at it, I'm already somehow disconnected from what it actually is. It doesn't mean that I cannot look at it and see what it is, because I can do that. But you see, this is more of a complication of language. You see, when we use language to describe something, we need to understand that the language that we are using is merely words, and not the thing that we are looking at or attempting to describe. And this brings up one of the most important essays I think you should read, if you're interested in this stuff, is On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense by Friedrich Nietzsche. And this is essentially what he was speaking about. What he was basically saying is that language is disconnected from the thing in itself, and that morality is essentially anthropomorphic, and that we create our own beliefs. Therefore, we create our own convictions through observation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the thing that we are convinced is true. Because what is truth? And this is the question that I've spent a good deal of my life thinking about. What is truth? How do we understand what truth is? What even is it? Can we ever speak the truth? Can we ever know the truth? Can we come to a general consensus that is unequivocally true? I don't think so. Because how could we? If we are disconnected from things by way of language, and see, this is a language problem. I'm not saying that you cannot experience reality, although that's another question in itself. But what I'm saying is, how can we describe reality through language if we have created it? You see, this is the struggle, and this is the question. And if life is somehow in a state of perpetual flux, if it is continually shifting, changing, transforming, transmutating, then how could we ever describe such a thing? If the thing was the thing that it was yesterday, but it is not the thing that it is today, that it was yesterday, then how can we say that it is true with what we have said about it? And this brings up the whole entire categorical imperative again. You see, we place things into categories. We put them in little boxes, which is essentially a reductionist mindset, which is what science basically is. Science reduces things into smaller and smaller categories, failing to see the whole entire thing. Which is very interesting, and it's almost humorous. Because you see, this is the game that we play with ourselves. We have fooled ourselves and forgotten that we are God. It's an interesting game. It's a clever game. It's adroit. It's punctilious. It's fascinating. It's beautiful if you think about it. You see, we have forgotten that we are everything. That we are one with the chair, with the table, with the computer screen, with the tree, with the flowers, with the dog, with the cat. We are one with everything, but we fool ourselves by reducing things into categories by way of language. Because you see, it is human nature, I think, to deceive ourselves. To convince ourselves that we are above nature, that we are preeminent, omnipotent, and in the midst of our perceived infallibility, we have fooled ourselves so greatly because it's a beautiful thing. And this is something I think about. And I think Shakespeare also understood this when he said, "Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you. We are spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air, and like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, ye, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little lives are rounded with a sleep." And you see, what he is speaking about here is entropy, dispersal, death, decay. The ephemeral nature of life. And this is even somewhat sort of a existential crisis, this poem. Obviously, this was before the existentialism and nihilism of the late 1800s and the early 1900s. But it still pointing towards that direction. And this is a problem that we, as philosophers and as people and as a society, have been wondering and thinking about for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Trying to figure out what this is, failing to realize that we have fooled ourselves so greatly, so profoundly, by way of language, that it's laughable. You see, through thinking about this, I have realized, or rather, I became okay with accepting the fact that we cannot ever speak about reality in a way which is totally true. Because you see, reality is constantly changing. We cannot speak concreteness into the flux. This would be a myopic thing to do, to speak concreteness into the flux. We must accept that the world is continuously changing, to flow with it, to accept, to let go, to not grow tense and try to somehow overcome or rise above this fundamental law. No, we must flow with it. As Bruce Lee said, be like water, my friend. Water can flow and water can crash. Flow with life. Embrace life. There is no necessity for undesirable tension. Amidst the chaos, be like water. Because you see, the universe is chaotic. The universe is in a state of decay. You see, we must consume in order to stay alive, or we will become emaciated into the point of death. You see, life is strong. Life is adaptive. And life is an enigma so beautiful. Because you see, what life has done is managed to organize itself in a way where it seems to somehow defy the laws of entropy, at least for a little while. You see, life is beautiful. Life is this ball of complicated processes that can't be explained. Although, that will not stop us from trying, of course. Science does this every day. And sometimes I believe in science. Sometimes I read science and I accept it. And then other times I realize that what we are doing when we speak scientifically is merely putting things into categories. Reducing things. Simplifying. Isn't that what we're always trying to do? Simplify to understand. Mathematicians, with their equations, what they're trying to do is simplify that equation down to something that is understandable. You see, we're trying to understand the world. We're trying to understand a world that is so complicated, so inextricable, so perplexing, that the only thing that we feel like we can do to be able to understand this world is to simplify it and to reduce it down to something that is easy to understand. But what if the universe, life, what if none of this is meant to be understood, but to be experienced, to be lived, and to be danced through? You see, music, I think, teaches us this. And you'll understand when you're listening to somebody who you think is a fabulous musician. When you listen to their music, they do not have to speak to you in words, but you understand. And you understand a lot more than you can understand if somebody were to just merely speak words to you. You understand something deeper. You feel it deep in your soul when you hear a good piece of music. It's a form of communication. It's almost a universal form of communication because everybody understands music because you can feel it. When Ludovico Einaudi plays a beautiful piece on the piano, he doesn't have to explain to you after what he just said. No, that would be ridiculous. He just played it. Listen, he would probably tell you. It doesn't need to be explained. You just feel it. And this, I think, is my general consensus that yes, we can philosophize all we want. And it's a beautiful thing. I can't remember exactly who said it. I think somebody said that philosophizing is nothing but mental masturbation. And if so, fine. It feels good, doesn't it? It's okay to philosophize. It's exercise for the brain. It's great to write. It keeps your brain organized. It keeps you smart and intelligent, capable. Which are all good things. But I think what you need to understand is that what you're saying is not necessarily true, even if it's beautiful. Which is totally fine. It's an art form, and I love writing, and I think it's a beautiful thing, and I will do it for the rest of my life. And language helps us understand each other, which, obviously it's advantageous in certain ways. But obviously, if you look deeper into it and you start to examine it thoroughly, scrupulously, diligently, you begin to understand that language is nothing but a creation by man, which doesn't necessarily speak concreteness into the inherent flux. So yes, sciences obviously serve some sort of benefit to our society. They help us understand the world. Or at least we think they do. Same with philosophy. Who am I to say that what I'm saying philosophically is more true than what science is saying scientifically? And you see, these are my convictions. And what I try to do is not have convictions, which is a very difficult thing to do. And it's easier said than done. And this was another struggle I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was dealing with in his philosophy. And I think it was in the Antichrist where he said, the only thing more dangerous to truth than lies are convictions. And this was kind of his whole entire philosophy, was beyond good and evil. He was trying to break down the barriers of morality. He was trying to genuinely understand what human beings were doing, what they were saying, and why they believe the things that they believe. And this is essentially what nihilism was. It was this tearing down, this burning. Even if we think about it alchemically, which I believe Friedrich Nietzsche was an alchemist, what nihilism was the calcination, the nigredo, the burning. It was the beginning stage in the transformation of the psyche of the masses, at least, or at least, more esoteric groups like philosophers and such. It was the makings of the world that we are living in today. It was the evolution of the psyche. Because you see, everything is constantly changing, evolving, and growing. The world doesn't stop It's always moving. Everything is always changing. Not being created or destroyed, but changed, remember? If we think about it thermodynamically. And this, we also see in social systems, in educational systems, in trains of thought, in philosophy and science. We see it everywhere. There's this perpetual evolution, which is always happening, and which must happen, until one day, when entropy has reached its highest state, and the sun dies, and all the stars burn out, all the planets, and all of the black holes radiate away into nothingness, and there's nothing but empty space. I guess is what they say. I think it's kind of a nihilistic viewpoint. I don't necessarily believe that that's what's going to happen. I don't think anybody knows what's really going to happen. We can say things and develop theories about what we think is going to happen, but how do we really know what's going to happen? But what I'm trying to say is that I don't think that we can ever speak truth about anything. This isn't to say that we shouldn't think about things, ponder things, write about things, philosophize. I don't necessarily think that we should repudiate science completely, although I don't necessarily believe in it, although I do also at the same time. Like I said, I kind of have a capricious relationship with science. But what I'm saying is that you should think about these things. And then understand that what is happening is that we are playing a game. We have fooled ourselves, and we have forgotten that we are God. That this is merely a game, is merely a dream. And this, once you realize this again, it makes you smile. Because you're like, oh man, I did it again. I fooled myself. What an idiot. But you see, you're totally caught up in the game. And isn't that the whole point? To be in the game? To let yourself be fooled? It's a beautiful thing. And I think that what this teaches us is to flow. To accept everything, to embrace it all, but to live. And this is what I suggest you do. Live. Live fully, openly, and let yourself be completely vulnerable to the world.